This is episode 15 of Youthful Perspectives. I'm your host, Mason Beerbaum. My guest today is Dr. Chantel Rodriguez, the Senior Public Historian at the Minnesota Historical Society and the host of the podcast titled Minnesota Unraveled. During our conversation, Chantel explains her role at the Minnesota Historical Society and defines what public history is. She also highlights the work she's doing on her podcast and the unique story she's uncovering by continuing to teach the vibrant history of Minnesota. Within Minnesota history, we discuss the historical significance the Mississippi River and Lake Superior have within Minnesota, the different fields of industry that have shaped Minnesota into the state we see today, the diverse background of immigrants Minnesota has welcomed into its ranks, and the role podcasting can play in sharing this information to a wider audience. Being a native Minnesotan who deeply loves this state, I sincerely appreciate the work Chantel and everyone at the Minnesota Historical Society does in stewarding this history of this amazing state. I hope this conversation will cause you to feel the same way. With that, here is Chantel Rodriguez. Well, thank you, Chantel, for joining me today. We'll start off with the first question here. Can you give me an introduction about yourself?
Sure. My name is Chantel Rodriguez. I have a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Minnesota. I am the senior public historian here at the Minnesota Historical Society. And prior to joining MNHS, I was an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the history department. And I also spent time as a research associate at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Okay. What was that like out in the Smithsonian History Museum out there?
It is definitely a really great experience to have. As a graduate student, as a doctoral student, I also had a doctoral fellowship while I was there, which was really great. Basically, it's just funding to do your doctoral research. And I got to learn a lot from that perspective, a little bit about what it means to use some of their collections and sort of network and go to a lot of their programs and events. And I sort of maintained those networks as I got my PhD and then ended up at the University of Maryland. And so then being able to apply for a seed grant through the University of Maryland and the Smithsonian to support this project, which public history projects at the Smithsonian are kind of, I would say, measured in decades. It was this project about traditional Latino healthways that we wanted to do. And so we received that funding to start that kind of work. And so it was really great to then be part of the Smithsonian from a different perspective as sort of like a PI, so to speak, and be able to learn how to navigate a very large cultural public history institution, which, as you might imagine, because it's so large, has a lot of red tape in how you're able to navigate and do work. But nonetheless, it's really a really great experience for me to learn what it means to do public history for a national audience, which is a really big challenge, and that's very different than doing public history at like the Minnesota Historical Society, where the focus is more about state or local history. Yeah. Has its own challenges, but I really did appreciate that experience.
Yeah, certainly. I can imagine it's very far-encompassing when you're at the national level in that sense. For sure. You mentioned also that you're the senior public historian here in Minnesota Historical Society. Could you talk about what that entails?
Yeah, so as a senior public historian, my primary responsibility is to conduct research and analysis. It's to develop solid historical methodology, and it's to communicate to the public how historical narratives are crafted, as well as how to engage in the historical inquiry process. And I sort of am able to apply that all over the place in various types of projects, from writing historical reports to supporting the exhibits team if they need me to do research, or working on our site's interpretive signage project, which is, we have 26 historic sites, and a lot of them have visitor centers and have programming inside those centers. But then we also have, a lot of the sites have trails that you can walk outside, and they have these large signs. And that's what I'm talking about when I say the interpretive signage project. And then, of course, the podcast and other forms of digital media. And so I'm able to sort of wield my content expertise, but also my expertise as a trained historian who fundamentally understands historical methodology and the guidelines that allow us to create reliable historical interpretation. So that's a general overview of what it means to be the senior public historian.
For sure. And you mentioned these 26 other sites. Right now we're recording at the St. Paul location, the the main history museum that most people would think of for Minnesota history. What are some other sites around the state that people would be familiar with?
Yeah, so this is the History Center, which obviously we have a museum, and you can come and visit some of the exhibits on the 3rd and 4th floor, and we've got a gift shop, and we've got programs that go on here. In the Twin Cities, we have a lot of various historic sites. So there's like the James J. Hill House, for example, or the Alexander Ramsey House, if you like to go check out these beautiful homes of some of the important men that helped to found our state. We have places like the Sibley House, which is also Henry Sibley. We have Fort Snelling, which obviously has a very long, robust history from the early 1800s through when it was active around World War II, and it still obviously is active in a certain capacity, but on the way it was before. And then we have a lot of, sites out in greater Minnesota, from the Forest History Center to Mille Lacs to Snake River Fur Post to Jeffers Petroglyphs. So we have a lot of different kinds of sites all across the state that I think people really enjoy visiting, especially when they're open. And I say that because, of course, the winter, right? Like, can you really walk around Jeffers Petroglyphs and check out these really great petroglyphs in the middle of December? I mean, kind of yes, but also no, because you won't be able to see them. They're covered by snow.
Absolutely. Well, that's the one thing I appreciate about the museum here is that it's open year round. And so whether it's -30 or like today, 90 degrees with some humidity, it's still nice and cool inside here, and you can explore all the exhibits that they have to offer. On top of your work here at the History Center, what areas of expertise do you have?
Yeah, so as a senior public historian, I'm supposed to be a generalist. So in many ways, I'm supposed to be like a Swiss Army knife. I'm meant to be able to jump all over the place in Minnesota history, which means in a given day, I could be working on multiple types of topics, from the U.S.-Dakota War to the early Cold War and fallout shelters to the Vietnam War, to just you name it, it's all over the place. And so I'm supposed to have a general expertise in Minnesota history, in Midwest history, and in U.S. history, and be able to sort of leverage that content expertise. But at the same time, above all else, I would argue that I'm supposed to be an expert in historical methodology, which means I need to firmly understand all those guidelines that historians use in order to, again, how do you identify reliable sources? How do you analyze and interpret those sources reliably? And then how do you craft a reliable interpretation out of those sources? And that is really kind of the bedrock of all the history that we do at the Minnesota Historical Society. And so I was hired again as a generalist. And yet, right, I still have my PhD in U.S. history, and I wrote a dissertation working on a book. And so I would say that if I have a general form of expertise, right, I'm a modern U.S. historian with a focus on labor, health, and citizenship. And I'm profoundly invested or interested in these sort of really big questions about what happens when geopolitical, legal, and cultural borders are crossed by people in particular. What does it mean for the individuals through that experience to forge a sense of belonging and community? So in many ways, right, I'm kind of a social historian, right? I'm really interested in the stories of individuals and communities and how they create a sense of, again, belonging. And I think that's something that's very central to public history. People come to sites and they want to hear stories, and they want to hear stories about people, individuals and groups, and how they interact and relate to each other.
Yeah, and it certainly makes it a lot more relatable too when you can hear these individual stories or these communities, especially if you're a member from one of these communities too. I can only imagine that it makes it a lot more interesting. Not that the other ones wouldn't be interesting at all too, but it certainly hits a little closer to home, I would assume. We kind of talked about this a little bit here, but maybe if you can go a little bit more in detail about the work of a public historian and how it's different from the traditional historian that people are familiar with.
Yeah, I think part of my answer for that requires thinking about what public history is. And I would say that public history itself is a concept that has been the subject of much debate. I think academic historians in particular have defined public history in a number of overlapping ways. They sort of defined public history as this field of study or methodology. They defined it as an approach to supporting communities and telling their own stories. And they've also sort of defined it as a way to do historical practice outside of the academy. And then there's communities themselves, right? Communities who have used public history as a tool, or even, I would say, go as far to say that they've used it as a movement to achieve whatever, goals that they want to achieve. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to think about public history, but the sort of common thread across all of these different kinds of definitions is that public history is for public audiences. Mm-hmm. And even then, that's really broad and leaves us with, well, who is the public in that kind of definition? So if we say that public history is for public audiences, I think we start to see a very big difference between public history and like traditional or academic history. And that is audience, right? So academic historians who traditionally work in university settings, when they're doing research, writing books, writing articles, their audience is people like them, right? Mm-hmm. They are writing these books and articles because they are in dialogue with each other. We call it like the history of history. It's the historiography, so to speak. So these academic scholars have read a ton of books, leading back decades or even hundreds of years. And they understand the nuance of all of those arguments. And all of the sources that they used and all of the methods that they used. And so when they write something, they're making a point or making an argument that's being added to that ongoing conversation and that dialogue, right? And so that's their audience. It's really the ivory tower. It doesn't mean that academics can't write public histories or histories for general audiences, because they certainly can. But on the whole, we can say that's the sort of approach for their audience. But public history does not wade into that conversation at all. They're not interested in that dialogue. They don't want to get into those historiographical debates. Especially here at MNHS, we are primarily invested in finding ways to engage people's curiosity about the past, which means finding ways to do that. And that can be through individual stories, or telling those stories through a lot of different platforms, from going to historic sites to programs to documentaries to podcasts, to exhibits to signage and all the things like that. And so I would say the big difference is audience. And another big difference, obviously, is the mediums through which they attempt to communicate that information. And yet at the same time, I would say that both public history and academic scholarship and academic historians are fundamentally invested and have a commitment to the idea that doing good, sound, reliable history is based on the building blocks of history, which is sources, right? And so both have a commitment to ensuring that you're doing history well, that you're relying on sources, whatever they may be, textual, oral history, traditional history, and being able to craft that into something that's a reliable interpretation of the past.
Yeah, I think that's helpful moving forward to distinguish the two, because people hear a historian, like that title get thrown out there, they might just be, they don't know the differences that reside within that term. So it's important to clarify that up. You mentioned something about how communities have used public history to enhance their own community or uplift them. Is there a particular story that you could highlight where that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of examples about that, but I would say, being able to tell your own story and have the agency to do so is a very powerful thing for communities, right? And so one of the episodes that we did in the podcast is about muralismo, right? So it's about muralism in West Side St. Paul. And these murals are often almost always just imagery, but sometimes they do have text on them, right? But these images that were happening and being sort of painted in the late 60s and really throughout the 1970s in the West Side St. Paul by the Mexican-American community were part of the Chicano movement, right? And so the Chicano movement was about celebrating pride in one's ethnic identity. And part of that was also reclaiming one's history. And so you have all of these murals that they are putting on the sides of buildings, and they're telling the story of the Chicano history. Right. And that was a very powerful movement for these folks to not only claim identity, but to claim space. Right. And that was really important in this context in particular, because the Mexican community that was living in the West Side at the time, about a decade before, in the early 1960s, they had lived in the West Side Flats, which had a series of floods in the 1950s. And because of urban renewal programs, were kind of forced by the St. Paul Port Authority to leave their homes. They were displaced. Some got some money, others didn't get any money, right? And so they basically had to find a new place to live. And so they kind of moved up, sort of like a nearby, up the street where the floodplain wasn't really an issue anymore, and had to recreate community, basically. And so being able to, right, well, how do you recreate community after your house was bulldozed, or you lost everything, right? Part of that is having a sense of creating community through rebuilding businesses, right, or schools, but also through telling your own story, right, and connecting through to your own ethnic identity. And so in that way, I would say that's a very powerful way that community was using history, not through writing books, but through painting that history, right, in these very transitory kinds of ways through murals. And so I think that's just a really powerful example of that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I know I've taken the light rail going from Minneapolis to St. Paul, and if you're looking out the windows, you can definitely see some of those murals on the west side of the town, and they're very beautiful. I always appreciate seeing them. And I was just talking to someone at my job the other day who was from Portland. He was an artist, and he was talking about how they have a very vibrant mural scene going on in Portland, Oregon, and they have artists and they get sponsored by these certain groups that go out and create this beautiful art in areas that maybe people would initially think is a beautiful setting, but they bring this beauty to them. And the fact that this community was able to bring beauty through also enhancing their community and the history of that community too. I would love to see more of that happening here in the Twin Cities area. That'd be great to see. Another area we had talked about previously off air was this the great man theory of history. I think it's important maybe if we could talk about that a little bit and why it's kind of controversial in understanding historical events and individuals.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to understand is that there are a lot of schools of thought around history. And in the 19th century, the great man theory of history was popularized at that time. And so it is a school of thought, one of several schools of thought that came out in the 19th century. And so the idea behind the great man theory is that, and a lot of these schools of thought for history are really all about trying to understand what causes historical change, right? What is the agent of change? And that's a really big question for historians overall. And so this great man theory of history, the idea was that historical change primarily happens because of the work of great men or heroes, right? And these great, often white men, are able to cause this change because they have some sort of extraordinary ability or the ability to be a great leader or have some sort of divine connection, right? And so that was very popular in the 19th century, which was also popular at the time of an approach to doing history that was invested in telling a story about the nation state. And so this great man theory really did infuse a lot of these early histories that are just telling these stories of heroic stories, right? These men are put on these pedestals, and it's all the stories are about all the great things that they did, right? To either help build the nation or the state, or local areas, right? And so inherently, there's nothing wrong with talking about individuals that have been very influential, right? The issue within the context of the great man theory, right, is that it does not fully contextualize that individual. And it's so invested in lauding them that it refuses to acknowledge the complexity of these human beings, right? And so I think that's why it's been so controversial, right? I think that historians today recognize that, but in terms of public history, right, the idea of telling the story of an individual and someone that's been very powerful is obviously still very appealing. But the other sort of flip side of the challenge, or what it leaves out, of course, is that, well, if you're only telling stories about people that are influential and are heroes, then what about everyone else, right? What about the people that aren't heroes or aren't deemed heroes, or what about the women or the children or these other kinds of groups, which is why there's other schools of thought, right? There's people's history, there's Marxist theory about classes and things like that and other schools of thought that are trying to, again, they're in dialogue with each other. And so, again, for me, inherently, there's nothing wrong with talking about these folks, right? It's about how you do it and how you approach it, and really think about that context.
Is there an example within this school of thought that's like the primary example? One of them that's maybe coming to mind, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, and the direction I'm heading is maybe Thomas Jefferson and how people put him on this pedestal for writing the Declaration of Independence, third president of the United States, Louisiana Purchase. But then he also had a plantation with many slaves on top of it too. So is that one example of the great man theory of history?
Yeah, that would be an example, I would say, so many, and again, as I mentioned, the school of thought in the 19th century, the great man theory is also simultaneously happening with a lot of historians who are writing stories about the development of our country, right? And so you can kind of see how they kind of come together to try and tell those kinds of stories. And again, Thomas Jefferson, incredibly important to our history. Definitely need to be telling his story and what he was able to contribute to, in many ways, like the legal construction and political construction of our government, right? Again, I think historians today, as you mentioned, right, you're very much aware of the fact that he also had a plantation and owned enslaved peoples and things like that. And so I think in the past few decades, there have been people who have trying to question that, right? Well, can we make his story more complex?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to not to ignore all the great achievements and just focus on the bad, but also you don't want to not focus on the bad at the same time. So there's that healthy balance that has to be, juggled with when you're dealing with that. I want to switch over here now to the Minnesota Unraveled podcast. You're the host of this podcast. Could you talk about what your podcast is about and what's your favorite part about hosting it?
Yeah, so the premise of Minnesota Unraveled, right, is that Minnesota history is this rich tapestry of diverse experiences and cultures and events that tell the story of our state, right? And so through the podcast, what we're hoping to do is to take listeners on this journey across the entire state where they start to ask questions about things that are around them, right? And that's a curiosity angle of it. And so for me, what I'm really excited about with this podcast is that so much history over time, because of the sources, have been focused on heavily populated areas, right? Urban centers. And so even if you look at our collections here, there's so much representation of the Twin Cities, which is fair, right? It's like the largest metropolitan area in the state. But there are so many other stories about the past that exist beyond that. And so being able to say, well, what is Minnesota history? That's in many ways part of what we're exploring in the podcast, is to help people to really think about what constitutes Minnesota history. We could get into that about, again, how 19th century historians help to define what state history looks like. But I think that this podcast is helping people, I hope, to really think about when we talk about Minnesota history, it does encapsulate so much that I didn't even think would have encapsulated Minnesota history. I think in part because Minnesota history, when you hear Minnesota history, I think people default to that's a political history of the state, right? Like, how did it become a state? And what did it look like and how did it grow over time, right? But you can also say, well, can it also be a social history? Can it also be a history of sport? Can it also be an environmental history? Can it also be a cultural history? Can it also, right? So many different ways that you can think about the threads that compose Minnesota history. And I think for me, that's my favorite part of being able to explore these stories with community, because every episode has multiple guests. And so it's not me just telling a story in each episode. It's me asking questions from the guests and myself sort of exploring these topics together.
And within that, because you talk about all these different threads that there are to cover and the different, whether it be cultural or environmental histories of the state of Minnesota, what other topics in particular have you guys covered on the podcast so far?
Yeah, so since we have luckily no specific focus and topics or themes. We've been able to cover a lot of different types of topics. So we've done everything from muralismo, which we just talked about, so muralism in West Side St. Paul in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s up to today. We've talked about the early Cold War and fallout shelters. We've talked about better baby contests at the Minnesota State Fair. We've talked about the history of bison, Native American basketball, to monuments, to, I mean, just a lot of different topics, which are really covering the gamut of all Minnesota history.
Yeah, and when you're going into making these episodes, what's your creative process like? How do you decide, okay, we're going to go down this rabbit hole here on this subject, and then you go out and record these different guests? What's kind of behind the scenes? What does it look like when you're making one of these episodes?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things for me is always thinking about what makes a good episode and what makes a good history episode. And one of our primary goals or mission here at MNHS is to spark curiosity in the public writ large, right? And get them to ask questions. And so we really did take that mission to heart and apply that to our podcast. And so the idea behind how we craft these things is, can we find a topic or event that will inspire that curiosity, right? Something that will make people lean in and say, oh, I didn't know that. Or I thought I knew that topic, but now you're saying there's something else to it that I didn't think about before, right? That's that curiosity. And framing it up as a question, a historically minded question that will get people invested in wanting to listen until the end, right? And so that curiosity is really important, trying to figure out if that topic is going to be able to accomplish that for folks. And I think, being able to highlight multiple perspectives is really important. We talk about the threads of history, and you can't tell a story without understanding various types of perspectives. I think also the creative process for us involves ensuring that we have regional diversity, right? Because we don't want to tell just only stories about the Twin Cities. We want to get out to the entirety of the state of Minnesota. And so the creative process is keeping all those things in mind and then trying to figure out also, right, it's not just us. We do have to do community outreach and sort of, so we get these ideas and then we talk to some of our colleagues here, like in community engagement or Native American initiatives. And we say, hey, we have these general ideas for topics. What do you think? Do we have any connections with community members? Do you think they'd be interested? And then we speak with community members and say, hey, we hear that you're doing this kind of project, or we hear that you're really interested in talking about this history. Would you want to collaborate and partner on doing this episode? And for me, that is what embodies a practice of public history, right? Public history is about doing history for and with the public. And that's something that we do in the podcast because every episode has those guests who have decided to share their story with us, right? And so my job as a host is just to facilitate that, right? I'm helping to steward their stories, which is what we do at MNHS, right? Like we don't have ownership over these stories. It's the public stories, and we're just helping to amplify and steward them.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly can relate to that in some vein. Hosting this podcast is, I'm just here trying to facilitate, try to squeeze as much juice out of that story as possible, and as my role as being the host. But also coming from greater Minnesota, I can speak on behalf of that part of the state and saying thank you for focusing not just on the metro area, because there is a lot of rich history within Minnesota outside of the Twin Cities, on top of all the rich history that comes within Minneapolis and St. Paul as well. So thank you for doing that. And also I think covering these stories or these historical events or communities that already get a lot of coverage, and then providing nuance. I think that's a great way to go about making episodes too, because I used this example before where I had this class my spring semester at the University of Minnesota called The Politics of Nuclear Weapons, which is quite a daunting title for a course right there. And I go in and I'm like, I have a decent understanding of this, that, and the other thing when it comes to this field. And then our professor, who just did a phenomenal job, would just give us some information, provided some nuance. And I literally come out of the lecture hall more than once where I'm like, my idea that I had walking in is now completely different walking out of the classroom on this particular topic. So I think if you're able to do that, people really are going to listen to the end when it comes to whatever you guys are putting out through the podcast. Moving forward, is there an episode that covers a topic that Minnesotans might find unexpected or more interesting?
Yeah, so I think for me, we talked about this concept that historians are really interested in figuring out what are the agents of change, right? And I think something unexpected might actually be, we did this episode called Rivers of History. And the idea was, can we tell a story about water? Like, can we tell a story about rivers? And rivers aren't people, right? So how you can't go and interview them. They're not leaving behind paper trails. But people do have relationships to the river, right? They have experiences with the river. And so in my mind, at least, I think that would be an unexpected kind of story, because you are learning about a river, a non-human actor, and its ability to make history, its ability to be an agent of history, right? Because yes, humans can relate to it, but also it can be challenging, right? To recognize that rivers can actually impact human history, right? And so the Mississippi River itself, for example, is something that was obviously forged over millions and millions of years. There's geological processes that are involved and things like that, right? But as we know from existing and recorded histories, but also through Native knowledge, right? Rivers mean something very particular to Native people, right? They have a spiritual connection to it. It's a relative, and that's probably an entirely different tangent in history, right? But the story of the Mississippi River is a story about Native history, but it's also a story about how humans have tried to figure out how to utilize the river and how to attempt to, in some cases, control it, and in some cases, steward it, especially from the Native perspective, right? And so the Mississippi River shows up in the past and in terms of its relationship with humans, specifically, for example, through the fur trade, right? I mean, the fur trade starts sort of taking off in the 1600s, and rivers, prior to obviously today where we actually have planes and other ways to really quickly transport goods and materials, rivers were the highways, right, for transporting things. It enabled folks to be able to get in birch bark canoes and take all of the beaver pelts and other animal pelts and be able to take them where they needed to go, because they were ultimately going to Europe, right? And so I think that's a fascinating way. And in that particular episode, we talked with 3 different people. We talked with a historian who talked about sort of the history of the 1800s and early 1900s, where humans, in particular white settlers, were realizing that they wanted to navigate the Mississippi a lot better, for example, using steamships. But something unexpected about the Mississippi is that before it was messed with by human beings, in particular white settlers, it was pretty shallow, right? I mean, it was only like, 12 to 18 inches deep because of a lot of the sandbars. And if you go further south on the Mississippi, as deep as 2 feet, right? And so how are you going to settle a place? How are you going to use steamboats to carry people and goods and materials? How are you going to float lumber down these rivers in order to mill them and turn them into lumber if you don't have a navigable waterway? And I didn't know that before. And I just realized that they had to work really hard to figure out how to make it navigable, meaning making it deeper so it can actually carry steamboats and other kinds of boats, right? And then we also spoke with a Western archaeologist and an indigenous archaeologist who were able to talk about the rivers and learning about them through the discipline of archaeology, right? Looking at the ecosystem of the rivers and how that has changed over time, right? Like literally the animals and the critters, and in this case, the mollusks, right? Who lived there and how they have profoundly changed because of human activity has been really fascinating. So for me, that's an unexpected story, right? Because now we have the story about this non-human actor that's making change and then humans are interacting with.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I really had a pleasure listening to that episode in preparation for recording this here today. And yeah, everyone, I feel like if you're born in Minnesota, like myself, you kind of take the Mississippi River for granted, and especially the fact that its source spawns out of Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. and the historical significance of not only to the state, but to the entire United States and the nation itself, and the fact that it just begins in our home state. Like, it's a lot of pride that should come with that too, and trying to maintain and make sure it stays healthy and all the other ways that we can do that. So yeah, I really appreciate and recommend people to go listen to that episode, because this really is a well done podcast episode. Another body of water, per se, in Minnesota that has a lot of historical significance is Lake Superior. Could you talk about the historical significance of Lake Superior in regards to Minnesota?
Yeah, so obviously the Mississippi is obviously very central to Minnesota history. Like you said, it begins at Lake Itasca, goes to our southern border. It's about 680 miles, I think, only in Minnesota, but continues on in total for like 2,300 miles, which is pretty wild. But the Mississippi and its watershed is obviously separate from Lake Superior and that watershed. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that we actually, despite the fact that they're separate, actually are very much connected. And one of the ways we can talk about that is the fur trade, right? And so a lot of fur traders are coming up around like Canada through Hudson Bay, and they end up around the Lake Superior area, in part because there were native communities that existed there, had very sort of robust and bustling society and economy effectively. And so we have, sort of fur posts basically that are getting set up there. And so people are taking canoes in the watersheds from Lake Superior and portaging, meaning like they pick up the canoes so they can go to a separate navigable waterway and make their way to the watershed of the Mississippi, and then continue on that way, set up their wintering fur posts, make connections, kinship ties, et cetera, with Native American communities. And then by the spring thaw, right, around April, they head back all the way back to Lake Superior and further out to get to Montreal before you can get on another ship to make your way back to Europe. And so there is just so much human and economic activity happening because of Lake Superior, because Anishinaabe and other Native communities lived in that area for so long, because they had a lay of the land, not just let me tell you where to go, but also because they firmly understood the ecosystem. They knew where to find beavers. They knew how to trap beavers, right? And other animals that they were also working on. So I think the fur trade is one way that you can connect Lake Superior to what's happening in Minnesota, because the fur trade is so significant to early Minnesota history from like the 1600s through before it declines in the mid 1800s, right? And then there's also, in the Rivers of History episode, Lake Superior, the indigenous archaeologist, Selena Bernier, talks a lot about the sort of, one term is the old copper complex, but she prefers a different term, right? The copper carrying communities. So Native communities were basically mining copper for a really long time, a lot of which was found in the Lake Superior area. And that network extended far beyond Lake Superior. And they were using that copper and sort of cold working it and creating tools and jewelry. And you can find those still archaeologically, right? On banks of rivers and in other places. And so I think also that means that you have this profound connection. If you find copper in Minnesota, you're like, where did this come from? And you can trace it back to Lake Superior and to native ways of mining and using copper, but also crafting these incredibly complex native trade networks. They weren't only in the Midwest, right? I mean, if you take a step back and look at the entirety of the map of North America, you have these fascinating, complex trade networks where you can find pieces of copper that were from Lake Superior out in basically what becomes the American West. And also material that's only found, like obsidian in like the Yellowstone area, that's found over here. How does that happen?
Wow.
Native networks, right? And I think that's the fascinating aspect. And it's, yes, you can travel on land, but a lot of it's through waterways. So I like to think about Lake Superior in Mississippi as, even though, again, very physically separate watersheds in terms of human activity, still very much connected.
Yeah, it seems like humans just have an innate connection to water in general. I mean, the fact that Earth is, 75% water, the land of 10,000 lakes that we call Minnesota. But it's fascinating to see all the trade networks that were used through these historical highways, you could call them. That's very fascinating. Within Minnesota's past, what have been some of the most important fields of industry that our state has had?
Yeah, that question is fascinating because in many ways that gets us back to what we might consider the traditional political state history of Minnesota. And for so long, and these are absolutely true, right? If we're talking about the primary industries that helped to develop Minnesota after it was a territory, then became a state. So we're talking about mid to late 1800s and early 1900s. We're talking about railroads, right? Because yes, rivers, not very navigable for what we need them for. And railroads can obviously transfer goods and people much more quickly. So the railroad industry comes to Minnesota, starting to build those in like the 1850s, 1860s, really starts exploding by the 1880s in terms of track mileage. You have the lumber industry, which is really huge in Minnesota. The lumber industry companies start showing up as early as the 1820s because they're seeing all the wonderful white pine that exists within Ojibwe homelands. And because of a series of land cession treaties, et cetera, that land becomes owned by the United States. And these timber companies just come in and they, over the period of 60 to 70 years, effectively almost deforest the entirety of the Northwoods.
Right.
But at the same time, all that lumber, that white pine is incredibly lightweight and durable. And so it's very important for building construction, right? So homes in Minnesota, but also in the Midwest and as far as out to the West, right? So Minnesota as an industry for lumber is helping to fuel westward expansion and help to build all these new cities that are transpiring, right? So railroads, lumber, we have mining is really, really obviously important up in the Iron Range, right?
Yep.
I think it's an incredibly underrated industry when you think about it, in my opinion, right? I think, and before the steel crash in the later 20th century, Minnesota was one of the primary, exporters of steel. In many ways, I would argue we helped to build places like Chicago because that's how much steel that we are producing and then shipping out. And so mining is a really, really huge industry as well. And of course, like flour.
Yeah.
And milling, I would say, is probably the other really, really big one for obvious reasons. And then lastly, tacking on to the end of that like periodization from 1830s to the early 1900s, around the 1880s, the meatpacking industry becomes really, because now we have railroads, we're getting refrigerated cars. We do an entire episode on meatpacking as well. You can learn more about that. And so the meatpacking industry becomes really big, right? We get the St. Paul stockyards and we have cattle that are coming. They need to get to Chicago. So the St. Paul area becomes this wonderful landing place before it can get to Chicago, right? And so the stockyards are not just the place where cattle and sheep are coming through, but also becomes a place where it can be packaged. So you get these packing houses and stuff like that. And so meatpacking is really huge in St. Paul through like the 30s and 40s. It kind of starts to go in decline. Listen to the meatpacking episode where you learn where they go after that. Yeah. So I would say those are like the top industries that folks identify as like being core to Minnesota's development and growth.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with all those that you've listed. Yeah. Within these fields, is there any individual stories that you find personally interesting? No, that's probably a very open-ended question. I can go many directions right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have been really fascinated by the lumber industry. And in particular, we did this wonderful episode 107 on Paul Bunyan and Bate the Blue Ox. Now, obviously, people have talked about it. Is he real? Is he not real? Likely not a real person, but maybe based on one real person or multiple real people, right? But nonetheless, I think Paul Bunyan as a figure who is so important and representative of the Northwoods and of the lumberjack and how important that was like culturally to that community, I think is a really fascinating story, right? Because it's a story about how actual lumberjacks in the Northwoods are making sense of their experiences. I mean, lumbering is hard work. And it's a physical job. It is kind of awful when you read about their conditions of living in these logging camps, physically demanding. And so they're sharing these stories around campfires, and that's how we kind of get the Paul Bunyan story. And it's obviously this fascinating myth that becomes then commercialized and popularized in different forms, right? Not just in stories, but in books that people are writing. And then he becomes like the figure for advertising for various lumber companies. And so for me, that story is incredibly interesting because I am, as I mentioned before, I'm interested in individual stories, but I'm also very interested in how communities and generations over time make sense of their experiences. And they do so through the figure of Paul Bunyan. And so I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that episode yet, but that episode to me is fascinating. We brought in a historian who's done a lot of work on the statues themselves they're in Bemidji. Now, to be clear, there are lots of different statues and figurines of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox in Minnesota and all over the United States. But the ones we talked about in the episode are in Bemidji, and they were created in the 1930s for like a winter carnival.
The necklace, Paul Bunyan, right?
Yes. It's the one that just,
He doesn't have a neck in that.
Does not have a neck, right? And it was not meant to be permanent, and yet here it is in 2025, and it still exists, and it's still a huge tourist attraction because it's meant different things to different generations over time. And so for me, I find that to be an incredibly fascinating and interesting story that I imagine will continue on. And it's not just a Minnesota phenomenon, right? It became a nationwide phenomenon in the late 1930s. And you can find Paul Bunyan like globally, which I find to be even more incredibly fascinating.
I didn't know that either.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. That is fascinating. And we talk about the people that work within these industries too, and the lumberjacks, and a lot of them. I mean, if we have this significant Native American population within Minnesota, but if you're not part of these communities, then you had to come from somewhere else. In a lot of places, there was European settlers at first. And within that, is there any interesting individual stories regarding European immigration to Minnesota that you think deserves more attention? Because I know there's quite a diverse amount of European immigration that's happened within our state's history.
Yeah, there is a lot to pull from on that. But I think for me, one of the things as a historian that I'm always really interested in is, can we go back to stories we already know and find a new way to approach it or find a new angle? And for me, one of the interesting stories about early European migration, I suppose, would be Father Louis Hennepin, right? And so he, as many people probably, your listeners probably know, right? Hennepin County is named after Father Louis Hennepin. And he was this Catholic missionary who was in what we now call Minnesota in the mid-1600s. And we actually talk about him in our 2-part episode on the history of bison, because he, again, was a Catholic missionary. He came with this sort of like exploratory expedition, of whom many of these expeditions always had some sort of missionary to, either proselytize to the men that are part of that party or also to the native peoples that they would find. Right. And these early explorers, and in particular Father Hennepin, wrote down all of his experiences like in a journal with the intent to publish them and sell them and earn some money from that. Right. And so he was meticulous in writing things down and what he saw. Right. And he wrote about the landscape. Right. He wrote about the bison that he saw. He wrote about the birds that he saw. He wrote about native peoples and what he thought they looked like. Right. And sort of like the outsider looking in, not fully understanding, right, the society or the culture. And so for me, his story is interesting because almost always his story is interpreted as, oh, he's just, part of these early explorers, right? He's perhaps misunderstanding the native community, right? He even mentions the fact that the Dakota are burning land, right? Because he thinks that they're trying to chase him away. But it turns out, we know now, right? Native people have practiced controlled burning, right? As part of stewarding the land. But he didn't know that. And that's not how he wrote about it. So obviously now we know to be careful when we use that source. But for me, part of it is if you want to learn, as I've mentioned before, I'm interested in environmental history and these non-human agents, right? So if you want to try to figure out how many bison were around, right? What did the landscape look like? He has so many great parts of his journal that talk about that, right? And so for me, all of a sudden, you can actually start using Father Hennepin's journals in a different way to tell his story, not just about what he saw, but use his story to start sort of painting a picture of what the landscape might have looked like.
Yeah. That is fascinating. And just to think of being in this area in the 1600s and how different it would look now, that would really just be such a fascinating document to read. Put yourself in his shoes and see what he was seeing, or try to imagine what he was seeing. But on top of, European immigration that Minnesota has had in its past, there's also other areas of the world that Minnesota has experienced immigrants coming from, whether that be from Southeast Asia or East Africa, down Latin America as well. Is there any stories within those regions that you think are interesting and deserve more attention?
Yeah, one of our episodes, actually the final episode, 115 on Hmong foodways, is actually one of my favorite episodes because it started simple with the fact that I pass by the Hmong marketplace every day on my way to work. And, I eventually obviously stopped there and tried some of the food, and I'd never had it before. And I was just like, I really like this food. It's speaking to me. I like the flavors, these ingredients I've never seen before, but I like the texture. Everything was really working for me. But then I realized, well, I don't know anything about Hmong culture and people and what this food means to them. And that led me down, conversations to learn more, do some research, but also start talking with folks to learn more about that. And so for me, I thought it was going to be a story about food. And it was, but it was also a story about immigration and what that experience is like.
And before we get too far ahead, maybe for the audience, for those who might not be familiar, where in the world would like Hmong the ethnicity come from?
Yeah, so they are ethnicity. And so they primarily at the time, Hmong people in Minnesota came here because they were political refugees, right? The Secret War, which is a parallel war happening at the same time as the Vietnam War, right? In like the 1960s and early 1970s. The Secret War was sort of this clandestine war run by the CIA, and they wanted to recruit Hmong folks, but also folks of Laotian descent and other people in that region of Southeast Asia, basically, right? And so that's how they ended up over here, because they fought in that war on the United States side. The war ends, i.e. the Vietnam War ends. It does not go well for the United States, right? North Korea, the communist government, wins.
North Vietnam, correct?
Yeah, North Vietnam wins. Laos falls to the communist government as well. And so anyone that fought for the United States was basically targeted, right? And so we have all these Hmong folks who are now being targeted and fleeing for their lives, right? And so they tend to flee north to Thailand, right, across the Mekong River, and then through various forms of like humanitarian aid and refugee aid, end up in places like the United States and other places like France and things like that. And so when you think about Southeast Asia on a map, right, geographically speaking, you have to kind of think about Southeast Asia and you have like Vietnam on the edge, and then you have Laos, and then you have like Thailand sort of north. And so Hmong people were primarily living in Laos, but they obviously also kind of generally lived in that vicinity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for people to understand the historical significance of that too. And it's also interesting the parallels that you're describing when it comes to the Vietnam War ending, and then also like the war in Afghanistan ending, and how this is kind of a similar situation occurred where the people that were aiding the U.S. effort in Afghanistan also were facing violence from the incoming Taliban government, and how they had to flee as well. So as the Mark Twain quote goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And it seems like in that case, it certainly was rhyming. But to go back to the Hmong foodways, you're finding a very rich culture within these foodways. You want to keep on talking about that?
Yeah. So I think that story, like I said, foodways for me, I thought was going to, originally I was like, oh, it's going to be about food. But then I realized as we spoke with our three guests, right, Chef Yevang, who is the chef and owner of Vinai, a very popular restaurant in Northeast Minneapolis, Paku Heng, who was the inaugural executive director of the Hmong American Farmers Association, and then Zhangxi Li, who comes from a long line of shaman and sort of practices sort of so like an herbalist effectively. And all three of these individuals experienced, right, the trauma and heartache of having to flee after the end of the Vietnam War, ended up here as political refugees. And all of them tell these stories about that past being incredibly important to understanding their experience here in the United States, and how they understand their relationship to food or to plants, right? And so for me, that became such a complex story that was both about food, but also about history and how you make sense of your experience. Some of them were like, Paku was like born in one of these refugee camps, was only there for 15 days before she left. Jiangxi was a toddler at the time and spent several years in the camp. And then, Chef Fang his family was at the refugee camp for 10 years. Right. And so he grew up there basically before coming to the United States. And so all of them, have this commitment to honoring that history, honoring the incredible sacrifices that their families made in order to get them out of Laos, to make it to a refugee camp, to live through the refugee camp, and then make it all the way, in this case, the United States, because they were often sponsored by various religious groups, and then to rebuild a family and rebuild community, right? And all of them want to honor that legacy and carry on that experience, but also carry on that experience through food.
Yeah. And that was one thing I really took away after listening to that podcast episode. It was the importance food has to different ethnicities or cultures throughout the world. And there was, I forget who exactly it was that mentioned this in the episode, but he was talking about how he didn't want his middle school and high school friends to see the food that he was eating because he was ashamed of it. And I never even thought of that. Like, food can be so important or so, I don't know, foreign to some people that it could be looked upon with shame or disgust. And I guess food also is very particular to people depending on your taste buds, obviously. But that's something I've really thought of, is like food could bring upon shame to some people, but also in the inverse, it can bring upon such pride that you see, whether it's in that market you were talking about earlier or the restaurants as well. So again, as along the other episodes we've mentioned, I highly recommend listening to that one too, because it really does give a unique perspective on the Hmong diaspora that we have in Minnesota, and also the food that they brought with us as well. Shifting now towards kind of public history through podcasting, what role do you see podcasts playing in the field of public history?
Yeah, I think one of the things about doing public history work, right, is that I think when people hear public history, they think museum, right? And they think, oh, I'm going to a place, right? And I'm going to go to a museum, I'm going to see an exhibit, or I'm going to go to this historic site. I'm going to walk the trails, or I'm going to walk through this really old house, and I'm going to really feel what it was like to live in this place. And which are all really great experiences, of course, to be able to immerse yourself in that history and to feel like you're having some sort of tangible connection, or at least to understand what it might have been like to live in those places. But there's also an audience expectation when you go to these places that you're going to hear a story. And when I say story, I mean a complete story, right? You want to know everything that happened, or you want a story that has a beginning, a middle, and the end. And that's fair enough, right? You want to understand fully about the family whose house you are now walking through. Now, the challenge, of course, with that is that I think people don't realize how difficult it is to actually do the history to create a full story. So much of doing history is finding just scraps of information and actually never being able to put them all together because the pieces are missing. And by that, I mean, we just don't know. There's no records in the library or in the archives, or in terms of oral histories and just sort of oral information passed down. It's not there. And so it can be really challenging, I think, sometimes to think about what does it mean then to do a podcast where you want to help people to get curious, to ask questions about the past, but then also to realize that history is complicated, right? That doing history, the act of doing history, of finding sources, of trying to interpret them to create a story is incredibly challenging. And more than 50% of the time, you're not going to get a full story. That is, in many ways, frustrating for people. But also, if you're thinking about trying to do a podcast where you want to engage people, you don't want people to feel unsatisfied, right? And so for me, doing a podcast is great, right? Because the medium itself unlike an exhibit where you walk up and have a text board,
Right.
and you're like, I have 120 words to read, and that's it. There's no space for qualifying information. There's no space to say, well, actually, it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
For me, a podcast, right, where myself is the host, or I have guests, or I'm doing a voiceover, it creates the space for me to be able to say, actually, it's kind of complicated here, isn't it? Right? Or to even say that we don't know everything, but the people we're going to talk to are going to help us to understand how we can possibly get close to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, podcasts are great for that reason, because we get to help folks understand that history is complicated, that there's oftentimes not a neat bow wrapped around a story.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, in terms of access, I think podcasts are really important, because it's great if you can afford or have a car to get to some place, right? To go to a historic site, or to come to the History Center to engage with an exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be able to do that. And podcasts are digital, and we can actually achieve our goal of re-envisioning access for public history and literally do what we want to do as an institution, which is to push history to all corners of the state. Right?
Yeah.
You can download your episode up in the Iron Range and listen to it at 4 a.m. if you want to,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't have to pay for it.
Yeah.
And you can do it at your own pace, right? And I think that is something that is incredibly important about podcasts and digital media, generally speaking, for engaging the public in history, right? It's just so much more accessible to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think accessibility is definitely like the one word you could use to describe podcasting
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to public history, is how you could, instead of taking your car and driving to the Minnesota Historical Society, you could take your car and drive to work every day and then listen to a podcast that you guys make through the Minnesota Historical Society. So that definitely makes it more accessible too. And also, I think it's interesting how like human history has been a lot of storytelling has been done through like the oral tradition of storytelling and not writing down things. And so it seems like we're almost kind of going back to how our ancient ancestors used to communicate back in the day. And now you're telling stories through just talking with someone. And it's kind of cool to see how it's slowly coming back around to that becoming more popularized as well. On top of the podcast, we've talked a lot about it, but where can people listen to the podcast if they're interested in listening to it?
Yeah. So you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, which I know is not helpful, but you can go to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts. I think on Amazon is also another place. We also have a website, right? mnhs.org/unraveled, where you can also go and click on the link and listen to it as an audio file. We also have a YouTube page that you can go and listen to it. But the aspect of being able to go to our website is that we have more information on there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go to our website, you can go to the landing page for that episode, and we have photos of the guests, and we have their bios, and we have a bibliography for like further reading if you're interested in the topic. And then sometimes when possible, we try and include other photos or materials that people might be interested in. And so I always encourage, I know it's like in the end credits or something, so people probably just turn it off and don't realize it. But if you're listening to this now and you want to listen to the episodes, I definitely suggest going to the website, just because you get a bit more information. And then if you're like, oh, but I really want to learn more, there's some really great resources there for you to do that.
Absolutely. And I can make sure to include a link in the description too that brings you right to that website, and then maybe the Spotify account as well. I have just a few more questions for you today. This one's kind of a fun one and a hypothetical, but I think it's kind of a fun question I like to ask guests in one way or another. If you could go back in time to either witness a period of Minnesota history or interview a particular individual from Minnesota, or for your podcast, Minnesota Unraveled, who or what period would you pick?
You know, I think we were talking earlier about environmental history, and I would love to be able to go back to any time before settlement, like white settlement, because being able to view the landscape, right? And again, looking at Father Louis Hennepin's journals or anything like that, you get all these descriptions of like the thousands of bison that were just hanging out on the river, right? Or the like millions of pigeons that were in the air that are blocking out the sun that are now extinct that you cannot see, unless we're going to go Jurassic World and try and like recreate them, which probably not going to happen. At least I hope not. And so that is something that you just can't experience anymore. Mm-hmm. And so being able to go back in time to a space to witness that landscape, to an ecosystem that has been irrevocably changed. Mm-hmm. In many cases, some of these creatures and animals and birds, they've just gone extinct. I don't know. I would love to be able to do that, just to be able to witness that. I mean, you can say, oh, you can go to a zoo to look at some really great things. Like, yeah, that's great. But I want to see it how it was supposed to be, right?
In
like,
nature.
In nature, to get a sense how this was. I can't even imagine that many birds in the sky blocking out the sun. I think it's the carrier pigeon that went extinct, and like the very last one died in a zoo in like 1914, right? You just can't see it. You can see sketches of it, and other things. So I think for me, that would be the dream, would be able to witness that landscape, right, of all of the animals and the creatures, and of course, native peoples who are living in what we now call Minnesota, to really just witness what that looked like before it all was all changed and developed.
Yeah. I'd probably join you on that journey, because it would be very cool to see that as well. My final question here for you today: why do you believe people should study history?
That's a great question. I would say when you study history, you begin to see all the ways that the past impacts, informs, and shapes our present, which I think is an invaluable thing to be able to understand, because I think sometimes folks imagine the past as being just somewhere behind us. Right? It just kind of exists over there, whether or not we understand it or not, doesn't really have a bearing on our present. Mm-hmm. And as a historian, I can say that's not true. There are millions of threads that connect our present to the past. And by that, I mean, right, everything that you imagine about our present, from politics to the economy, to architecture, to the roads, to various forms of technology, everything is connected to something that came before. Mm-hmm. And being informed about that, I think, is incredibly important, right? Just to be able to understand your world better, to be able to navigate it, to make informed choices about the present, but also obviously about the future. And historians will say, right, like, we don't have crystal balls, right? We can't predict the future, but I think you mentioned a quote earlier, right? If you understand the past well enough and you understand all those threads, you understand structures of power in particular, right? You can understand how those structures operate. Mm-hmm. And that can give you at least a general sense to anticipate things about the future. So I would say there is nothing more valuable than studying the past, because in order to understand your present, you have to know the past, and you can't know where you're going if you don't know all that.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Chantel, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Youthful Perspectives. If you enjoyed this conversation and are interested in learning more about the subjects we covered, a link to Minnesota Unraveled is listed in the description below. If you'd like to read more about Minnesota history, Chantel recommends reading the award-winning book titled North Country by Mary Leonard Wingard. For me, I appreciate Chantel's emphasis that history is complex and therefore requires thorough and professional research, something she excels at. It's easy to think great movements or events can come from the hands of one exceptional individual, but rarely in history is this ever the case. Instead, historical events and traditions are shaped by many individual hands who possess unique experiences that have created the world we exist in today. Without the work of historians like Chantel, these personal stories would be lost with time. But because of public historians, these unique perspectives further fuel the fire of curiosity that continues to propel the fluid narrative of humanity. As Martin Luther King once said, quote, "We are not makers of history, we are made by history," end quote. This is Mason Bierbaum, signing off.